Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at the Kennedy School. We're here for a very important event, and that is the Malcolm Weiner Lecture. I'm David Elwood. I'm the Dean of the Kennedy School. Let me also begin by asking all of you with cell phones if you would turn them off, or at least turn them to vibrate or some such thing, a product of our new technology. The Malcolm Weiner Lecture was established in 1989 through the generosity of a man that's sitting right here in the front row. Malcolm Weiner is my definition of a Renaissance man, and if you don't believe it, talk to him sometime. Talk to him about everything from Greek antiquities to the employment and training programs for youth in the Bronx, or half a dozen or a dozen other subjects, including the types of topics that we're having, that we'll be hearing about tonight. He is an extraordinary man, but also an extraordinarily generous man. And so let me just ask Malcolm to stand, and I'd like us to just thank him for his generosity. This particular lecture represents Mr. Weiner's interests in and his scholarship in international financial matters, including currency relationships and international monetary systems. And past lecturers have included Helmut Kohl, James Schlesinger, Václav Klaus, and Sir Leon Britton, among others. And so it's now my pleasure to add tonight's guest to this esteemed list. Martin Wolf is Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times. He is in many ways the dean of people who talk about economics in a way that's actually comprehensible and useful. Indeed, I'm going to read a citation from the RTZ David Matt Memorial Prize, which it's inconceivable to me that any economist, I'm an economist by the way, so I can put them down, would ever would receive such an award. It is for a writer to have judged to have made an outstanding contribution in the English language towards the clarification of national, international, and political issues and the promotion of greater understanding. And anyone that's read Martin Wolf's work knows that that's very much what he is extraordinarily good at. His analysis and insight are remarkable, and I think tonight's lecture will be no difference. He's got a long list of awards that he's received, including the Accenture Decade for Excellence Award, a Newspaper Feature of the Year Award, the joint winner of the Wincott Foundation Senior Prize for Excellence in Financial Journalism. And in addition, in the year 2000, he was awarded the Commander of the British Empire, one of the most prestigious awards given by the Queen of England for his services for financial journalism. He earned his Master's of Philosophy degree in economics at Oxford in 1971, joined the World Bank as a young professional. In 1981, he joined the Trade Policy Research Center in London as Director of Studies. And in 1987, he joined the Financial Times as Chief Economics Leader Writer. He has since been promoted to Associate Editor and, as I said, Chief Economics Commentator. In addition to writing for the Financial Times, he's a visiting fellow at Nuffield College in Oxford and a special professor at the University of Nottingham. Author of several books, but perhaps his best known work is on globalization. Most recently, Why Globalization Works, where he argues that although trade openness alone does not always lead to growth, it's absolutely essential as a starting point. He'll elaborate on these and many other kinds of things, but let me just add my personal note. It is wonderful and remarkable to have a man of such extraordinary character and talent here with us today. He is here to talk about, for us, a critical question I think that's emerging quite rapidly now, which is the end of dollar supremacy. Martin Wolf.
It's an immense honor to be here on this occasion and being able to deliver the Malcolm Weiner Lecture. There have been some staggeringly distinguished predecessors, so much so that I assumed this was a mistake. But anyway, it's too late now. I have several reasons for pleasure beyond the immense distinction of my predecessors. First, My son spent a very happy year here a little while ago, and I was unable to visit him, so I'm sort of belatedly coming to the place he enjoyed so much. Second, as I just explained to the Dean, one of the few real failures of my life was that in 1969 I applied to be a student at the Graduate School of Economics in this distinguished university, and knowing me obviously better than I did myself, they rejected me. So it's quite pleasant to be here at last. Finally, this is, of course, the greatest institution of learning and inquiry in the world, though I have to say, and I hope you won't take this in any way offensively, events of the recent weeks have made me question that just a little. The lecture I want to give, the lecture I will give is called, actually, The End of Dollar Supremacy ? The lecture that you will have seen doesn't have the question mark, and the reason for the question mark, as you will see and hear when I present this, that we are experiencing and watching at the moment in the relationship between the US and the rest of the world in terms of the global macroeconomic balances, something that has never happened before in the world, in the history of the world, in its scale, and in particular for the country that is the globally preeminent power. As of course, I'm sure you all know that when the United Kingdom was in a comparable position a little over a century ago, it had net assets vis-a-vis the rest of the world of about 2.5 times GDP. So it was about as different as from the current position of the US as you can imagine. And the interesting question is where this is all going to end up as it unfolds over the next 10 or 15 years. Now, in starting the lecture, I would like to start with 2 quotes which seem to me to set out the issues very clearly. The first is from the father of macroeconomics, of course a distinguished Englishman, John Maynard Keynes, who said, if you owe your bank £100, those were the days when the pound counted for something, you have a problem, but if you owe £1 million, it has. And the second quote is from someone I long admired, Herb Stein, the late Herb Stein, who said, of course, very famously, things that can't go on forever don't. If Keynes was right, and he often, though certainly not always was, then the rest of the world has a huge problem, and the US, of course, has no problem at all. For at the end of 2003, the last year in which for which the US has published complete statistics, the US gross liabilities to the rest of the world were $10.5 trillion, and US net liabilities were $2.65 trillion. Foreign governments owned $3.7 trillion in foreign currency reserves, and the Asians alone $2.4 trillion, and of that, at least 70% were denominated in dollars. So if, as Keynes suggests, the debtor's weapon is default, the US is in a supreme position in which to inflict default on the rest of the world. But if Herb Stein was right, the debtor too may have problems. This cannot last, and when it ends, as I will argue, the adjustment could be quite painful, or even very. The challenges confronting the US in thinking about these imbalances may be divided into a flow problem and a stock problem. The flow problem is that at present, the US as a whole is spending about 6% more than in its income, and consistently, and this has been rising on trend year by year for about 10 years. If its creditors were to stop their finance or increase significantly the cost of this finance, in what is called in the economic literature on Latin America, and I quote, sudden stop, unquote, Americans would, of course, need to slash their spending and shift output into the goods and services that the rest of the world wishes to buy. If that were to happen swiftly and on a large scale, a recession would be virtually inevitable. But the flight of creditors would also create a stock problem, even if the deficit were eliminated. For it would reduce the global value of US assets by raising of the assets denominated in dollars by raising dollar interest rates, the required returns on US real assets, and of course the exchange rates of US assets against all other countries. While this would hurt the creditors, it would also hurt the US. Americans would, in the context of the world, be unambiguously poorer. Now, it seems to me obvious, and indeed I've argued this for some years, it would be better for both sides to reduce the risks of such a denouement. But before I come to that, and the question of how we might do that, I think we should try and analyze the forces that have turned the world's sole superpower into incomparably its biggest debtor. What are the reasons for this, and how far can they be located in the behavior of the US, or, as I will argue, in the behavior of the rest of the world? For the principal point I would want to make here is that contrary to the implicit and natural assumption of most Americans, it is not Americans who are deciding their fate, but the rest of the world. And the American economy is adjusting to the decisions being made in the rest of the world, and principally in Asia. So let me look briefly at what's going on in the rest of the world. Well, essentially, if you strip out the US, the rest of the world is running a huge current account surplus. In other words, that surplus last year was about $660 billion. This is, of course, a savings surplus, an excess of income over expenditure in the rest of the world. This is true by definition. To put the scale of this in context, that surplus of the rest of the world is roughly equal to 12% of the rest of the world's gross savings. In fact, if we strip out some of the other English-speaking countries whose behavior is quite similar to that of the US, namely my own country and Australia, the rest of the world ran a surplus of $720 billion last year, and that's close to a sixth of the rest of the world's gross savings, which are coming into this country and also into those two other countries that I mentioned. This, I would like to stress, is a new, not an old development. It cannot be explained, though it is partly related to, by the long-standing mercantilism of the Asian emerging market economies in Japan. What I mean by that is the set of policies and institutions that have generated consistent trade surpluses over much of the last 20 or 30 years. But nothing on recent scale. As recently as 1996, the global balance of payments looked entirely different. The US then ran a current account deficit of only $117 billion. So what has happened since 96, and why? The immediate and obvious answer is that virtually every region in the world, except for the English-speaking countries I've listed, and Spain, by the way, an interesting exception, increased its current account surplus or shifted from deficit into surplus. Broadly speaking, we can identify two important groups of countries other than these English-speaking countries I've listed. The first group consists of mature, slow-growing, advanced countries and emerging market. The first group is mature, slow-growing, advanced countries, and the other group is significant emerging market economies, principally but not exclusively in Asia. The former group, Japan and continental Europe, generated an aggregate current account surplus last year of $340 billion. That was up from $190 billion in 96, though there was therefore an appreciable rise of $150 billion, but nothing like the scale of the counterpart of the increase in the US deficit. It was the emerging market economies that have really changed their behavior as they moved from a deficit of $100 billion in 96 to a surplus of 320 billion last year, a swing of $420 billion between those 2 years. This, therefore, is the principal counterpart of the rising US deficit. Now, why did this happen? The answer, I believe, is very clear. It was the direct consequence of the staggering shock these countries received during the financial crises, principally in Asia, in 1997 and 98. These had an extraordinary impact, not just, of course, on the private sector capital flows to these countries, which led to a short-term and painful adjustment of the kind I've described, which was inevitable, but above all, in the willingness of these countries to run any form of current account deficit. Their aim became instead to accumulate huge reserves as a way of self-insuring themselves, as a way of form of self-insurance against such disasters, and then make sure it would never be necessary to use them. To bring this out as clearly and as bluntly as I can, they decided that never again would the US Treasury and its proxy, the International Monetary Fund, be able to treat them in the way they were treated in 97 and 98. Data from the Washington-based Institute for International Finance tells a big part of this story very beautifully. Emerging markets have, of course, been net recipients of private capital quite consistently, principally FDI, but also portfolio equity and, at some periods, debt finance as well. The flow, of course, to emerging market economies as a whole fell to very low levels in the late 1990s. Until 97, however, these countries ran current account deficits which absorbed in aggregate most of the inflow of capital. That is why they did run those deficits, and there was no great global problem. Then came the crises. The current accounts of these emerging market economies, a subgroup defined by the IIF, swung from deficit to surplus by 200 billion. A large universe would give you larger numbers. In the latter years, however, these countries were also recipients of a net inflow of private capital of 160 billion. Basically, these countries took the entire current account surplus and all the private capital inflow and recycled the entire lot into US currency reserves. In essence, after these crises, emerging market economies have used the inflows of capital not to finance current account deficits and so sustain the normal pattern of flow of capital with a counterpart of current account deficits, as they did before, but to finance massive reserve accumulations instead. The direct aim of these reserve accumulations was, of course, to keep exchange rates down at a time of strong upward pressure, for the reasons I've explained, from private markets. China, Hong Kong, and Malaysia have avoided all adjustment against the dollar as it's been falling since December 2002. India, Singapore, Thailand, Taiwan have kept their appreciations to very low levels. The Japanese, with incomparably the world's largest current account surplus, have limited their appreciation to 26%. Over the same period, the euro appreciated by 50%, the pound by 34%, the Canadian dollar by 32%. In essence, the entire Asian region has devalued against the floating currencies of the world. The scale of the accumulations of foreign currency reserves that these countries have had to undertake in order to offset both their current account surpluses and the capital inflow into them has been absolutely staggering. 45% of the total of 3.7 trillion in global foreign currency reserves at the end of last year had been accumulated in the last 3 years. So in essence, half of all the reserves accumulated in history have been accumulated in the past 3 years. Between December 2002 and December 2004, the most intense period of accumulation, just 2 years, Japan's reserves rose by 440 billion and China's by 400 billion. It's worth thinking about what these Chinese reserve accumulations mean in the context of the Chinese economy. Over the past 2 years, China's total gross domestic investment has been in the rough order of $1.5 trillion. Thus, its accumulations of foreign currency, 400 billion, reserves amounted to just under 30% of its total domestic investment and an eighth of GDP. It is really impossible to believe that this is not a gigantic waste of resources, even by the standards of a country that wastes its resources on an impressive scale. But it is part of a wider regional phenomenon. Overall, Asian countries invested an additional $1.2 trillion in foreign currency reserves between December 2002 and December 2004. Essentially, by linking their currencies to the dollar, the Asians have created a new currency area, which is described by some economists at Deutsche Bank as a new Bretton Woods. I refer to it simply as the extended dollar area. Because most of the world's current account surpluses are contained within this area, the dollar itself is being given quite strong support. But this area does, in fact, have a current account deficit itself. The US deficit offsets the surpluses elsewhere. If people outside that zone invest in any country within it other than the US, that country will automatically have to recycle its inflows towards the US if it needs to do so to keep its currency down against the US dollar. This is how it works. And since the extended area contains the world's most attractive destinations for FDI, it is not surprising then that the dollar has remained quite well supported overall. Its real exchange rate has depreciated from its peak only by some 17%, and despite these gigantic current account deficits, the real exchange rate is vastly above today, where it was between 1988 and 1995. Now, what has this behavior meant for the US? Well, essentially, the US is responding to and accommodating this behavior. It is trying to run demand in a way, it's not conscious, but it is inevitable, in a way that accommodates the world's excess savings and still sustains US output as close as possible to potential. In other words, a level at which we old-fashioned economists used to call full employment, and nowadays you'd probably call the natural rate, or NAIRU. It is the country best able, of course, to fulfill this global adding up function because it is still able to issue what is incomparably the world's most desired monetary store of value. That the US is not an autonomous actor, but at the mercy of events in the rest of the world, is, I think, difficult for many people here to accept. But it is very easy to see from any analysis of the financial balances in the economy, namely the three principal balances, that of the foreign sector, the foreigners, the government, and the private sector. For most of US post-war history, the private sector ran a small financial surplus, the government ran deficits, and the foreign sector was broadly in balance. There was, of course, a big current account deficit in the early 1980s, whose domestic counterpart was the fiscal deficit, the famous twin deficits of that time. But that external deficit disappeared by 90. Since then, however, something completely unprecedented has happened. The foreign sector went into ever larger surplus with the US. Essentially, foreign lending exploded. That is the counterpart of the current account deficit I've talked about, to reach 6% of GDP last year. Until 2000, the domestic counterpart of the rising foreign lending was a massive move into deficit by the US private sector. That's what sustained demand here during the bubble era, while this huge leakage of demand was occurring through the rising current account deficit. In fact, during the bubble years, again, completely unheard of in American history, the private sector's financial balance swung from a surplus of 6% of GDP to a deficit of 5%. In other words, over that period, private sector spending in this country grew faster than income by 11 percentage points of GDP. After the bubble burst, the private sector, of course, went back into balance, though not, even so, back into surplus. The US private sector is still spending like gangbusters. But since foreigners kept on lending, it has been the government that ended up taking the strain. If you look at the figures, you will see that the shift of the US government into deficit is a perfect mirror image of the shift of its private sector into balance as the current account surplus deficit has risen. Thus, the job of sustaining demand in the context of the huge drain of the current account deficit shifted from the private sector to the government. If the US government had not gone massively into deficit, what would have happened? There would either have been a huge recession, which would have reduced the current account deficit a little, but I think not that much, or a still more aggressive monetary policy. In fact, we would have seen Fed funds at zero, and we would have seen monetary policy here looking quite like that of Japan. The widely held view that the fiscal deficit is causing the current account deficit today is, in my view, completely the wrong way around. It is much closer to the truth to say that the current account deficit or foreign lending, the behavior I've described in the rest of the world, is causing the fiscal deficit. It is equally wrong to argue that the current account deficit is merely the consequence of relatively fast US growth. It is rather the consequence of relatively fast demand growth in the US in relation to GDP or supply, and that is largely a function of the overall real exchange rate, or to put the point in less technical terms, of US uncompetitiveness given the behavior of the rest of the world. The story could be told quite simply in the following way. US demand has had to grow faster than potential GDP to accommodate foreign lending, technically at the real exchange rate of the dollar created by the policies of the rest of the world, which I've described. US demand grows faster than potential output if actual output is to grow in line with potential output. In other words, if there is to be full employment. And that is, again, precisely what has happened. From 1997 to 2003, real demand grew faster than GDP in every single year in this country, with the exception of the slowdown year. And cumulatively, the difference is 5 percentage points of GDP. Necessarily, these relationships between US demand and supply have, of course, precise counterparts in capital flows and trade. These are identities. However, 2 points need to be made here. Up to the end of 2001, the flows pouring into the US were private. It was easy then to argue that the external deficits simply reflected the unparalleled attractions of the US new economy, you remember the new economy, I'm sure, to profit seekers around the globe. Between 2000 and 2004, according to US balance of payment statistics, 43%, I repeat, 43% of the finance of the US current account came from foreign official sources. In round numbers, the net official inflow, according to your balance of payment statistics, was $720 billion. In absolute terms, I like to remark, this is incomparably the largest foreign aid program in world history. This also has had huge effects on the structure of US output and trade. In particular, and this is very important for the future, which I will come to in a minute as I close, imports are now about 50% larger than exports. In fact, they're close to 60% now. This is the consequence of a long period in which imports have grown on trend at about 8.5% a year, going back to 1990, while exports have been growing at about 5.5%. And the implication of this is brutal and straightforward. If GDP growth in the US on trend is about 3.5%, possibly a little more, exports have to grow hugely faster than imports merely to keep the trade deficit constant as a share of GDP. In fact, to put the numbers roundly, exports have to grow about 1.5 percentage points a year faster than imports to achieve this over the next 10 years. Let me explain what that means. It means if the trade balance is to remain constant as a share of GDP, and it's already huge, export growth has to double from its recent levels if import growth is not to fall very sharply as the other way of making the balance. At the end of 2003, US net liabilities to the rest of the world were 24% of GDP. If the past 15 years' trends continue with no adverse shift in the relative cost of funds to the US, which I think is an unbelievably optimistic scenario, the ratio of net liabilities to GDP will reach 120% by 2014, and the current account deficit will be 13% of GDP. These are just what can't go on, won't. By then, the US will be selling net liabilities each year to its annual gross exports. Even if the current account deficit were to remain constant at current levels as a share of GDP, the net liability positions will reach 70% of GDP. The only developed countries ever to have such net liability positions in history are countries like Ireland. I cannot believe the US is going to be in this category. So what on earth is going to happen now if we look into the future? Are the Asians going to stick with this policy, and should the US be quite as comfortable and relaxed about where it's being driven as it seems to be? I think the Asians do need to think very seriously about where they have now got to and think very hard about alternative ways of running their economies. It's becoming hard to sterilize the monetary impact of their reserve accumulations. The real returns on the assets they are accumulating in the US are low and are going to get lower when finally the currency adjusts. They risk huge capital losses when those currencies adjust. Subsidizing exports through an undervalued exchange rate and unhedged lending in a foreign country is bound to be very expensive. And most Asian countries already have reserves close to or even greater than 100% of imports. That is more than enough for any conceivable purpose. But there are reasons why they're frightened about changing their policies. The present policy gives their economies a monetary anchor. It preserves export competitiveness, which they worry about, particularly the Chinese, and it creates a de facto Asian monetary system, and perhaps it is even indirectly a way of keeping the US fat and happy. Overall, however, I do believe that it is making increasing sense for the Asian emerging market economies to find an exit strategy. Accumulating reserves on this scale without limit cannot possibly make sense, but they need help in finding that strategy. Now let us look at penultimately, how does it look to the US? Well, actually, it's looking great to the US. The US is enjoying a staggering transfer of resources from the rest of the world. The current account deficit is significantly bigger than the fiscal deficit. It is significantly bigger than the US entire military spending. Unlike the Vietnam era, the US really is able to enjoy guns and butter at the same time. So what are the drawbacks of these huge current account deficits and the bigger ones to come on present trends, if any? Well, first, US industries in the tradable goods and service sector are weakened. Second, if the fiscal deficit is to be reduced and the current account deficit remains so large, the US private sector has to be pushed back into massive additional spending. If the foreign credit is cut off, the dollar will plunge, interest rates will rise, and the economy will go into recession. And the creditors are, it should be recalled, not necessarily altogether friendly. Indeed, there is much discussion of having a war with one of them. So what should be done? The process now underway seems to me self-evidently unsustainable in the long run, indeed in the medium run. If it is not corrected in time, the US will end up with a huge adjustment shock. The correction, we know what it means, involves a real exchange appreciation, would involve a real exchange rate a depreciation and a recession as interest rates spike upwards. Moreover, the bigger the net liabilities and the larger the current account deficit at the time of the correction, the larger the shock is going to be. What we need then is some serious economic diplomacy. And of course, for that, we would need some economic policy making in the US and an administration that is more barren of economic thinking than any other in my memory. What would such diplomacy consist of? Serious discussion of new exchange rate regimes, and there are complicated issues there, fiscal tightening here, expansionary policies in Asian emerging markets, principally China, combined with a commitment to serious structural reform. These changes do not have to happen overnight, but the discussion on how to do this does have to start now. The world simply cannot run indefinitely on the engine of US demand and soaring US current account deficits. If these trends continue for another decade, as some do believe possible, US net liabilities will have become so large as to make management of the economy hard and management of the dollar itself extremely difficult. Just remember the painful decade that followed the ending of the first Bretton Woods in the 1970s. this will be a much bigger shock. This is not, I think, the legacy this generation of Americans should wish to leave their children. It would be far better to take action now than to let the tide of accumulating external debt roll over this country. And by the way, it is debt, not simply purchase of real assets. And as Rabbi Hillel said, if not now, when? Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for that uplifting talk. As is our style here, we have microphones around the auditorium here for people that would like to ask questions. We have one right here, another one here, a third one right up here, and a fourth one there. And let me just remind everyone of the ground rules for questions. One is that the best questions start with an identification of who you are. They are then short and they end with a question mark. So let me start right here.
Thank you. I'm Tatiana Rosito. I'm an MPID student at this school. Thank you for the very insightful and provoking presentation. I want to take one of your last points, the need for economic diplomacy, and combine with one of your previous sentences, that is, Asians need to be helped. And then if we think of all your presentation, in fact, they have many assets, and maybe the position, the best approach to that is to make them more accountable and then to give them more responsibility. And my question then is, wouldn't there be a need for strengthening multilateral mechanisms and to make the G20 financial area more effective in these terms? Thanks.
I agree completely, and I've written this on many occasions. One of the great tragedies, in fact, the IMF was created to deal with problems of this kind, broadly speaking. That was one of the things that they wanted to do. Of course, the world context has changed, but the IMF was created to deal with this. The G7, in a way, was created to deal with it as well. The problem in both of these cases is that the representation on these two bodies, the informal body, the G7, the formal body, the IMF, is completely outmoded. One of my favorite statistics is that Belgium's quota in the IMF is bigger than India's, which is a rather striking fact, isn't it? And of course, as you know, the IMF has always been run by a European, even though no European country, no Western European country has borrowed from the IMF for 25 years. So it is of no interest to them except to mess it up. And they have done quite an impressive job of this. The IMF was run out of the pockets of the Treasury in the 97-98 period, and that is, as I already explained, very bad memory. The US Treasury smashed the idea, which in my view was entirely sensible and right, of an Asian monetary fund. I've written a lot in favor of that. So I agree completely that the structure, management, and running of the formal institution, the IMF, is utterly inappropriate, and it's one of the reasons the Asians have abandoned it effectively, completely. They've basically made a unilateral declaration of independence for it. The G7 is, of course, a ludicrous institution now. The G8 is even worse. I hope you all realize why the difference between the G7 and the G8 makes it worse. The G20 is not a bad body, though I personally think it's a bit too large. In essence, what you want is a grouping operating at an informal level which contains those countries which have significant influence on the global system. It is clear that there are a number of Asian countries in that category, but the number of countries outside the Asian region that are in that category is quite small. But I have no problem with the G20. The fundamental point, however, let's forget all the rest. The fundamental point today is quite simple. We cannot do anything at all in any of these areas without the fullest possible cooperation and mutual understanding with China. This is maybe something we may not like. Personally, I think it is completely natural and inevitable, but it's simply a reality. And if we don't deal with them, across the board in all these issues a serious power that it is already, and even more that it will become, we will not manage any of this.
Right up here.
Good evening. My name is Angel Pascal Ramsey. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I have a question for you about capital flows. You have mentioned that part of the origin of the behavior of Asian policymakers emanates from the financial crisis of the late 90s. So in the light of that, I was wondering if you could comment, share some of your thoughts about the wisdom of the policies that international monetary authorities, especially the IMF, seem to be pushing during the 90s, of forcing countries which in many occasions did not have developed financial infrastructures and institutions to accept free capital flows into them, and also what kind of solutions do you envision to solve these kind of problems, especially the, of course, short-term outflow of capital? Thank you.
Do we have half an hour for this one?
I do.
But I think I will bring this short. I don't think I want to go through the history in detail of the policy making before 97 and the role of the various institutions and governments in bringing about the crisis situations, particularly in Asia. And it is worth stressing that the Asian crisis was particularly surprising, not only because they've been very successful and stable over a long period, but because, of course, these are countries with very high savings, which did not naturally need very large capital inflows. But if you look in detail at what happened in the period up to 97, 98, there is a great deal of blame to go around. The IMF is certainly culpable, so is the US Treasury, so is the OECD. That was very important in the case of Korea, and so were these governments. They made a number of quite astonishing policy mistakes. To take an example of a country I know relatively well, Korea actually discouraged long-term capital inflow and encouraged only short-term capital inflow. The more interesting question, however, is the nature of the solutions. And my view now, very crudely and simply, though there's a tremendous amount of complication here, it has two elements. The fundamental thing, it seems to me, that countries, let me put it around another way. We live in a world of floating exchange rates. In other words, we have a world of many monies. It's quite different from the gold standard era, for example. We have a world of many monies. If you borrow in a large way in a foreign currency through your financial system, you will inevitably necessarily create very significant currency mismatches within your financial system. If you have created those currency mismatches within your financial system and your exchange rate moves significantly, given the normal capitalization of a financial system, banks, you will end up with mass bankruptcy of your banking system. So my view, in essence, is countries cannot borrow in a floating rate world in large quantities in foreign currency. So the solution is to borrow in your domestic currency. And when you think about that, well, actually, that's not so difficult if you are willing to develop your financial markets to do that. The characteristic of Asia, and this is what makes all this so surprising, is it is a massive saving surplus region. It contains most of the world's savers. It makes no sense and never has made any sense to transmit those savings via New York back to those countries in a foreign currency. In fact, this is where part of the question mark, the end of dollar supremacy. If the Chinese and other countries took seriously the business of developing domestic financial markets using domestic savings in domestic currencies, they would be free of these currency risks, and of course, the role of their currencies would vastly increase in the world. I have no doubt that is the direction in which they should be going. We can discuss at great length what that involves, and there are many policy reforms. But the crucial point is you cannot cope with foreign currency mismatches in your system. I don't know whether you come from South America. It sounded as though you might. That has been one of the biggest single problems in explaining the difficulties of many South American countries.
Right here.
Thank you. My name is Toby. I'm a student of international development here at the Kennedy School. Assuming that economic diplomacy can work, do you envisage any solution to the dollar time bomb other than one that does not involve a significant depreciation of the currency?
Depreciation.
Yes.
There has to be a significant real depreciation of the dollar in order for the incentives to shift in this economy. In the classic analysis, you have to end up with a situation in which the incentive to produce tradables is dramatically increased. I'm not going to go through all the terms of trade and other effects. And the incentives to consume tradables is dramatically reduced. And this is really quite significant in this case. Roughly speaking, the tradable goods sector in the US is probably 25% of GDP. This includes services, about 25%, perhaps 30%. And the excess demand for tradables is therefore about a seventh of production, a sixth or a seventh. You cannot deal with that without a very large shift in relative prices. One of the classic articles on this very point has, of course, been written, joint or co-authored by a very, very distinguished Harvard professor, Ken Rogoff, and I suggest you read the paper. I wrote a column about it. A real exchange rate depreciation does not necessarily require a nominal depreciation of the dollar. It could also happen with excess inflation in the Asian countries. In fact, in the classic specie flow mechanism that David Hume described, that is exactly what you would expect with these reserve accumulations. The classic mechanism would be huge reserve accumulations, enormous monetary expansion, excess demand, therefore, in China and other such countries, high inflation, over and above the real appreciation you would anyway expect from a very fast-growing economy. Over and above that, the price level in China might go up 30 or 40% relative to that of the US, and you would have got your exchange rate adjustment. As long as there is a real exchange rate adjustment, it doesn't really matter whether it happens through relative inflation or through the nominal exchange rate. But since the Asian countries are very clearly determined to avoid high inflation, the Chinese have shown that very clearly, the Indians have shown that in the past, the only alternative is in fact a dollar depreciation. The problem is, for the reasons that I've explained at length, dollar depreciation is essentially blocked by the emergence of the new Bretton Woods area or the extended dollar area that I've described.
Right here.
Andrew Woodcock, a mid-career student here. What do you think, looking 5 or 10 years forward, what's the best case scenario you can see as an exit from this? What would the optimal US policy be, and to what extent do you think it must inevitably coordinate a response with other countries? If so, which ones?
The answer to the last question is, and this is an essential point of my entire argument, the US cannot do this on its own. As long as these other countries are determined to maintain their real exchange rates at current levels, the degrees of freedom of the US are essentially zero. The only thing the US could do is have a depression. I mean, you can eliminate the current account, but actually if you go through the figures, and I've done that, the depression that is needed given the extremely low import intensity of the US economy and the fact that US tradable production are not very close substitutes for US exports. It's quite an important point. To give you a very trivial example, US automobiles cannot be easily exported at any price, right? And that is why that's why American companies produce different automobiles elsewhere. That's very, very important. So you do actually need this real exchange rate change to happen, and that means you've got to persuade countries to allow the appreciation. And it is very important to remember, while it's very, very hard to keep your exchange rate up, if the world wants to push it down, the reverse is not true. If countries can intervene without limit. So you have to persuade them that intervening without limit, for the sorts of reasons I've given, is not in their interest. The only alternative way, and that's why it requires diplomacy, adjustment, and discussion, the only alternative way to do it, of course, and it is a possibility I've discussed, but it frightens me, is what Nixon did in 71, which is an import surcharges. In essence, what he did was to say, you Europeans, it was mainly the Europeans and the Japanese at that stage, must appreciate against the dollar, and if you do not do so, well, actually, we've got these import surcharges to persuade you that it's a good idea. And I'm sure actions of that kind would probably be effective. They would also create, for the US, given the scale of its net liability position, now, as opposed to then when it was a very strong net creditor, a big problem for the US, because what they could do in response is dump the currency. And if you work through the whole mechanism, given how much of the of US treasuries and so forth are held by foreigners, this would jack up interest rates here significantly, given the US household sector is now leveraged to an unprecedented extent. That would create a massive recession. So I don't think that would be a very bright policy. So the conclusion is, given that you want currencies to have a real appreciation, you want them to pursue sensible expansionary policies, given that you don't want to have a depression here for very obvious reasons, there is absolutely no alternative to a serious discussion. And coming back to the very first question, the best forum for these sorts of discussions are multilateral. In economics, the idea, and I make the same point of trade, the idea that the US can pursue its interests unilaterally in the present world is quite simply nuts.
Up here.
Thank you very much. I'm Xinxin from MPA program of Kennedy School. I come from China. So my question is also about China. In the recent years, the Chinese government has received a huge pressure to reevaluate its currency. But at the same time, they cannot forget the bitter experience what happened to Japan in the middle of 1980s. The Plaza Hotel Accord is to some extent believed as the turning point of the Japanese economic development. So I just want to know what's your perspective if Chinese government make decision to reevaluate its currency in the near future. Thank you.
I hope I've understood fully the implications of your question, and there are many aspects of the Japanese experience which relate to this, but the normal analysis, which I think is a very relevant and important analysis in this context, is that after the Plaza Accord, which occurred in September 1985, which was the accord to push down the dollar after the first episode of current account deficit under President Reagan, the Japanese, in particular, were encouraged, in addition to accepting the revaluation, to promote demand very, very aggressively. And the Japanese view, which I think is correct, is that led to the bubble economy. And the aftermath was this staggering debt overhang, which the Japanese confront. It seems to me, though I perfectly understand the risk, the concern, that the Chinese situation is fundamentally different from Japan at that stage. First, as a matter of fact, it already has a tremendous overhang of bad debt. So it's very difficult. Well, it's not impossible to add to it, but it is. Second, it is adding to this overhang of bad debt as a result of its current policy. This is extremely important to understand. The reserve accumulations cannot be fully sterilized. They are leading to and have led to staggering credit expansions over the last 2 or 3 years and a huge investment boom. Many informed people in China, as I'm sure you know, are very concerned about the quality of the assets which are being created in the process. So it is actually creating bubble-type conditions by not revaluing. And indeed, to some degree, you might say the revaluation is an alternative to creating bubble-type conditions. More important, and this is where you get to the really fundamental policy issues in China, and I have written a lot about this, and I'm very interested in these questions. But if you think about it carefully, it is really very difficult to believe that China cannot find a way of growing satisfactorily and satisfying the demands of what is a vast and still very poor population without having a national savings rate which is not far short of 50% of GDP. To put it bluntly, it ought not to be beyond the wit of man and woman in China to work out a way and I think we can discuss at great length, I don't have the time now, what that would involve, to work out a way of promoting greater consumption in China. The reason the savings rates are so high, in my view, is a function of the still fundamentally dysfunctional financial system and the failure of the government to push faster towards creating some sort of pension safety net in China. Those are the huge structural issues. But unlike Japan, there is clearly, which was then a very mature, wealthy country, the case for higher consumption levels and more dynamic consumption rather than relying on massive increases in investment as the main macroeconomic policy tool is surely very strong. Or as I put it sometimes, the part of the solution to this whole problem is to make China a little bit more like the United States and the United States a little bit more like China.
This will be the last question.
Thank you. My name is Alex Wagner. I'm a PhD student in economics and here at the Kennedy School. I was wondering, you've talked a lot about what's socially optimal for the word, so to speak. Now, I'm also interested in political economy, and in political economy, the main actors, of course, are individuals who are self-interested. So I was wondering whether you can comment a little bit on politicians' interests to engage in working towards a solution like the one you've envisioned, also individuals in hedge funds, financial institutions, and so on. Thank you.
Well, obviously, the private sector's interest is merely to get its investments correct, and its key interest must be to get out of the dollar before it crashes. That's the usual problem, and if you have infinite confidence in your own wisdom and timing, you will hold the asset till it does. Unfortunately, there are usually some fools who don't get out in time. The more interesting question to me than the private sector in this context, because actually, by the way, that's a very important point. If it had not been for the interventions I described, which have been extraordinary in scale, the private sector would already be well on the way to imposing a solution. The dollar would have fallen by much more than it has. That would have allowed the US to pursue the interest rates here would be higher than they would otherwise be. The fiscal policy would be more obviously destructive than it now appears to be. So the pressure for tightening fiscal policy will be very great. The export sector will be beginning to be stronger. It is recovering, but even more strongly. And for the same reason, because the real exchange rate would have appreciated elsewhere, other countries, particularly China and other countries around Asia, will be finding other sources of demand. So I think the private sector would have done it. So the really interesting question is, could you persuade the political masters to change their minds? It seems to me self-evident that if I were President Bush and my time horizon was, how long is it, 3.5 years? And I look at the conjunction of events and what will happen if I allow this adjustment to proceed, the rational, and if my position is après moi le déluge, I have no interest whatsoever in the future of my country or of my party, the rational thing is to say, my God, I'm a lucky man. I can run a massive deficit, I can run a war, and I can still have my people operating at the highest consumption level in their histories. That's a sensational position to be in. I mean, it is completely staggering. So the rational thing for him to do is to do exactly what he's doing, and it seems impossible to persuade people. Indeed, it is hardly even discussed here, and certainly was hardly discussed in the election campaign, that this is rather a bad position to be. So the political economy of the US seems to me painfully clear. Poor Bob Rubin. Responsibilities doesn't turn out to be very good politics. The position in Asia is more interesting, and I think, and again, I think I've emphasized China even though it's not the biggest surplus country because I think it's the anchor. I think here they have the unfortunate fact, I've often wondered what would have happened if Zhu Rongji was still in charge. He understood these problems, he was very interested in them, and he would have understood the potential difficulties. I think it is an accident of history that there was a transition of power in China to a relatively inexperienced group without strong technical expertise in economics, unlike the previous administration, which was very concerned about stability in China, which is enjoying the fact of growth, of course, and has many other much bigger issues, and is not particularly concerned about the long-run consequences, again, of this policy. However, I do think if the Chinese think carefully through where they're going with this, and they realize that at some point there is likely to be a rather messy break in his policy, which will impose quite a significant shock in their economy, the case for making a transition out of it is quite strong. The difficulty they've had, I think, is not understanding the need for that, which has become more obvious with each passing year, but in actually working out precisely which of the many exit strategies to adopt. And this is where they need a proper engagement with really high-powered and credible American and global officials. And they have lacked that altogether. But my view now is that if there is any hope that this will stop, and this is actually related to a question I didn't quite finish before it gets to the bitter end 5-10 years from now, it's more likely to be on the creditor side than on the debtor side. From the US point of view, I know I'm in a minority and people constantly say that this is no problem. I have to say, if I were an American, and indeed as a citizen of the world very dependent on America, the situation in which this country might find itself, if these trends continue for another 10 years, would frighten the wits out of me. And they would frighten me partly because as a Briton, I'm familiar with these problems. We spent most of 30 years dealing with the so-called sterling balances problem. And the sterling balances problem was simply no more than the fact we had huge liabilities out in the rest of the world, which were the consequence of the Second World War, and people didn't want to hold them, or put it more precisely, they wanted to hold them in return at a cost which was very painful for our economy to bear. And that is the problem the US faced. Not that people won't hold these assets or liabilities, but that the long-term real interest rate they will expect in return will be very significantly above current levels, and that will impose a permanent drag on the US economy. So we shouldn't want to go there, but to come back to your fundamental point, as everybody knows, there is no future market in elections, and therefore politicians don't respond to this, and that is why I'm really quite pessimistic about the possibility of getting an escape before we hit a crisis. So the political economy suggests to me that people like me, and there are many such, will suffer the fate of Cassandra. They will be ignored, and by the time they are proved right, they will be dead.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for a terrific lecture, and you ended on the John Maynard Keynes note, in the long run, we're all dead. So thank you. Very good. Very good. No, I think we're okay.
Right on.